Hi everyone. So today I'm going to discuss question 2 and 3 of year test 1. First, I'm going to discuss the strengths in the test. In part A, most students did well in the calculation of the retained earnings at acquisition, so the what should have been done. In part B, many students did well in the calculation of the profit for the year and the dividends declared. And also in part B, most students did cross-reference the amounts in the statements of changes in equity to their calculations. And for the theory question, the students who attempted this question generally did well. Most of these students correctly identified the theory applicable. Now going to discuss the general weaknesses. Students are not referencing their calculations adequately, especially in part A. I'm going to show you an example of how I usually reference. It is not the only way that you can reference. There are many ways for referencing, but you have to choose a method that is effective, works for you, and that will help the marker when they mark your test. So what I usually do is I leave a blank page or 2 pages, if the required is long, for the final answer. On the next page, I then make a heading for the calculation so that the marker knows that that is where your calculations are starting. So this is here, okay? Then I start with calculation number 1. So here I calculated the new retained earnings at acquisition that has been used to determine the change in your goodwill, the NCI, and the retained earnings since acquisition. Okay, then for the revenue line item, you see I have a 2A next to it. This then takes you to calculation 2 for the revenue. So the marker immediately knows that this is where the revenue calculation is. I then reference the 2A here and then the 2A at the top where I put in the answer. So I do this for every single line item here. It makes it much easier for the marker to then know where all of your calculations are. I also make a heading for each of the calculations because it helps me to keep track of where all my calculations for the line items are. Because if you then later want to go back to it, then you know exactly where to find it. Instead of just random amounts all over the page and you can't remember which one is the revenue calculation or which one is the cost of sales calculation. I also do the same for the analysis. So for example here, I did the ordinary share analysis for calculation 9. And then for each item that I've calculated and used in my final answer, I've referenced with a 9A, the 9C, and the 9B, etc. Then, as you can see here, I have the 1A. This is the amount I calculated in my calculation number 1. So now the marker can directly see that you've calculated that amount in your calculation 1, and they can go directly to that calculation, and it makes it much easier. I'm not a fan of referencing only with numbers because in the end, when you have a lot of calculations, you end up having till a number 35, etc. And it makes it really hard to keep track of where the calculations are. So now here I know that 9 it has to do with the ordinary share analysis, and then 9A, 9C, 9B, etc. can be found in this calculation. So whenever I calculate something that I know should be in my final answer, I take it immediately to the place where my final answer is. Because otherwise, you stand the risk of not having enough time at the end to transfer your answer, and then you can lose a lot of marks. So here I've transferred the goodwill amounts to my final answer on my page 1 over here. And I do that for each of the items that changes while I'm doing the calculations and not only at the end. Time management was also a major issue in this test. Many students did not attempt all of the questions, especially part B of question 2 and also the theory question. Students still do not have proper exam technique. So after the reading time, you should first go and allocate your time per question. This ensures that you at least attempt all the questions, which is very, very important. Then you should first go and read the required carefully and slowly. In this test, it was clear that some students did not read the required carefully and it cost them a lot of marks. Then you should go and plan how you are going to answer the required before you start just doing random calculations, etc. And in this specific question, you were guided by the required on how to answer the test. And it was shocking to see how few students actually used that method to answer the required. Then you should go and draw your format, so if it's required. So in question B, they asked you to do the statement of changes in equity, the NCI column alone. So before you start to do the calculations for that, you should have gone and drawn the statement of changes in equity with the NCI column. Then you should go into your calculations and cross-reference them to your final answer. You should always focus on the easy marks and not allow yourself to get stuck on the difficult parts of the question, because otherwise you are not going to finish and you're going to lose the easy marks that are left over. So firstly, I'm going to discuss the consolidation question. So in A, there's one thing that many students didn't do. And that is that in the notes section, we suggested a method for you to follow in answering the required. And that is to calculate the what should have been done versus the what was done. We didn't give you this information for no reason. We gave you this information to make it easier for you to answer the required and get the maximum amount of marks possible. So in any future question that you do, always see whether there's a suggested method of answering the required, because it is there to help you and will also help the markers to understand what you want to achieve in your answer. The notes section also told you to indicate each affected line item and the related amount separately. Many students only said what line item would be affected without the related amount, or if they gave a related amount, they did not reference it to their calculation. Also, the note said to indicate whether the line item identified will increase or decrease with the amount calculated. Many students only said that the line item would change, and this is not answering the required, and it indicates that the students are not reading the note properly, which gives very important information. Question A also asked for you to calculate which line items and amounts in the consolidated financial statements for the year ended 31 December 2020 will be affected by the correction of the errors identified by the auditor. This 2020 is in bold, which means you should pay special attention to it. It is in bold for a reason. And that is the reason why many students did not realize that the errors were made in 2018 in the acquisition year. And therefore, the line items that changed are not your profit line items. It is in fact your retained earnings opening balance, because it asked you for the line items that will be affected in the 2020 financial statements and not 2018. Some students said that one of the line items that changes is the retained earnings at acquisition. This is incorrect because this line item is eliminated in your at acquisition consolidation journal, and that is why it is not a line item anymore in your consolidated financial statements, because it does not form part of your retained earnings opening balance. That is why the only changes that occurred were in your goodwill line item, your retained earnings since acquisition, and your NCI. You still had to go and calculate the change in the retained earnings at acquisition, so that you can use it in your ordinary share analysis to go and show the new retained earnings amount that you've calculated, to show the difference in your goodwill line item as well as your NCI line item, and also your retained earnings since acquisition. If you used an analysis in your calculations, you should have used two analyses for each type of share. You should have done what was done and a what should have been done for each type of share, for the ordinary share capital and as well as the cumulative preference share capital. There were no errors made in the non-cumulative preference share analysis, and therefore it was unnecessary to do that for question A. In the calculation of the correct retained earnings at acquisition date, many students did not go and calculate the correct income tax expense. They used the incorrect one before any of the corrections were made. When your profit items change, it will cause the income tax expense to change as well. You should have deducted the cumulative preference dividends in arrears. Many students did not identify that it has been in arrears for 1 year and 9 months and only deducted the 68750, which is for 1 year. Some students deducted the non-cumulative preference dividends in arrears. This is incorrect because the non-cumulative dividends in arrears will never be received by the shareholder in the future, and that is why it should not be deducted. A point I want to make about using an analysis in your calculations is the following. Many students did do an analysis as part of their calculations, but they did not use the amount in the analysis in their final answer to calculate the differences. It is then seen as pointless to do the analysis because you do not then understand the reason you did it. And that is why many students' marks were divided by 4 for this reason, because you did not know where it played an effect in identifying the differences. In Part A of the required, many students did not realize that there has been a change in your retained earnings since acquisition. You should have used the amount given to you in the trial balance, the 2216,875, which is your retained earnings opening balance for your 2020 year of assessment. You should have then gone and deducted this amount here, which is the amount calculated above in your retained earnings at acquisition date calculation over year. This is the amount before you've deducted the cumulative preference dividends in arrears, because you then deduct this afterwards. If you use the amount of the 953,189, it is incorrect because then you are deducting the dividends in arrears twice. And also this 17188 is the amount of the dividends for 3 months since acquisition date in your 2018 year of assessment. In your calculation above of the retained earnings at acquisition date, the cumulative preference dividends in arrears that has been deducted is for 1 year and the 9 months before they've acquired the subsidiary. And that is why in the since portion of your retained earnings, you deduct the remaining 3 months of the 2018 year of assessment after the acquisition. For Part B, many students did not read the additional information given. You should have used this amount as your opening balance of your NCI and then added the adjustment made in question A to that to get the correct opening balance. Many students wasted a lot of time by trying to calculate the correct opening balance of the NCI, while in fact this amount has been given to you and you've calculated the difference in NCI in question A. That is why in your answer you should have used this amount given plus the difference calculated in A. The format marks are also easy marks that you could get, but you cannot use any abbreviations, and that is why you did not get the format marks, for example, when you've used the word div instead of dividends, or when you've used the abbreviation NCI instead of writing it out as non-controlling interests. Also, always remember to state the name of the group at the top as well as the date of the consolidated statement. Let's look at some of the calculations for the amounts in your statement. So for the ordinary dividends declared amount, the 23125, this comes from your ordinary share analysis. So in the analysis, they use the amount of 450,000. This amount was given to you in the information, and it is the dividends declared by the subsidiary. Many students incorrectly use the amount of 165,000, which is the dividends declared by the parent company. The dividends declared by the parent company is never allocated to NCI. That is why in the question paper that has been given to you, it is incorrect to use the 165,000 and you should have used the 450,000. However, remember that the 450,000 is the total dividends declared by the subsidiary and thus includes the ordinary dividends and the preference dividends declared. And that is why I'll show you now in the calculation that you should have deducted the preference dividends to get to the ordinary dividends declared. As I've said, you should have deducted the non-cumulative preference dividends declared as well as the cumulative preference dividends declared to get your ordinary dividends declared by the subsidiary that is then allocated to your NCI. The cumulative preference dividends were in arrears for 4 years, and that is why you multiplied the cumulative preference dividends for 1 year with 4 years to get your dividends declared for the cumulative preference dividends. And that is also why in your cumulative preference share analysis, you used the 275,000, which is the 4 times the 68750. Many students did not attempt the theory question at all, and it was probably due to poor time management. Many students spent too much time on question A and B and missed easy marks by not doing the theory question. The students who did the theory question, there were some who did not identify that the supplemental information was not complete, neutral, or free from error.